Well, good evening, Manchester. Auburn Hooksett. This is the progress report for this Wednesday, October 19th, right in the middle of October. Folks, we are less than 3 weeks away from the election for President of the United States, Governor of New Hampshire, U.S. Senator, state senators, county officials, state representatives. All that's coming up on November 8th, so we're counting down to it. And we launched this edition of the Progress Report with, I hope, some people will have some good things to offer as we look toward that important election here in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is still considered a swing state, although I don't think that's really much that in doubt anymore as to which way this state is going to go, but it's still considered a swing state, and we understand that Hillary Clinton may be coming to the state on Monday. And we've certainly seen plenty of Donald Trump. We've seen plenty of Mike Pence. We've seen Tim Kaine. So we're getting lots of attention, as we always do, and that's because we do a real good job of casting our votes. So tonight, I'm really pleased to welcome as my guests on the program. Oh, by the way, folks, I have to say, unhappily, Mike Farley, who would be here, is not here because he's in Florida because his father is gravely ill. He was down there, as you may remember from last week, in the middle of the Hurricane Matthew, because his father's illness, and his father has taken a turn from the worst, so we're wishing him well, but we are missing him tonight. So it's just me and my guests, who are Tim Smith and George Bruno. And as always, we hope you'll call in and contribute to the program with your comment, question, 413-0223, 412-0223. So first I'd like to turn to George Bruno, fellow member of the New Hampshire Bar for many, many years with an incredibly interesting and variegated career. George, tell us a little bit about your background, because I think it's fascinating, things you've done in our state and around the world.
Bob, I arrived in New Hampshire on February 8th, 1971 from Newark, where I was a storefront lawyer, arriving day or two after the riots in that city subsided back in the 60s. My first client was the cab driver that sparked the unrest in that city. When I went to my office in the morning in the Central Ward in Newark, the city was still smoldering with a smoky overcast over most of downtown Newark. And I stayed there for a number of years and then had the opportunity to move to New Hampshire and create New Hampshire Legal Assistance, the statewide legal aid agency, and then helped create the New Hampshire Public Defender. And in those capacities, we worked up the state legislature to create the state's public advocate, the state's federal housing finance agency, the Tenants' Bill of Rights, and a number of other really good pieces of legislation. And as time went on, I became involved in political affairs and went to Washington for a while, working in the Justice Department and in the White House in the Jimmy Carter administration, and came back, got involved in politics, became party chairman for a couple of terms, and then joined the Clinton administration as U.S. ambassador and working in the State Department, and then over at the Defense Department at the Pentagon, commuting back and forth to Panama to facilitate the implementation of the Carter-Trujillo Treaty to transfer the Panama Canal, and then ultimately...
That was a very, very contentious issue.
That was a contentious issue.
You got to say
leaders.
That was a triumph for the Carter administration that they pulled that off. I remember the vitriol about, we stole that canal fair and square and we're going to keep it.
A lot of political leaders lost their seats as a result of that.
I think John Durkin maybe won, right?
No, it was McIntyre.
McIntyre.
who lost his seat, along with Senator Fulbright of Arkansas, I think Birch Bayh of Indiana,
Really?
and a number of others.
George,
George
that
McGovern.
that makes me think about the outcry by certain people on the other side of the aisle over the Iran nuclear deal. Oh, as Trump says, this is the worst deal in the century. But I think that the acceptance of the Iran deal is greater at the time it was announced than the acceptance of the deal to restore the Panama Canal to Panamanian sovereignty. And now today you don't hear anything about it. You don't hear anything that we've lost some significant part of our national interest by restoring this canal to the Panamanian nation.
Well, the truth is that as time went on, the Panama Canal became used less and less and became antiquated. The mechanisms and the operation of the canal still worked fine, but it no longer accommodated the ships that were transporting goods to the United States. They had the canal was overcome by the dry canal, which took its place. That being the railroad line from the Pacific to the Atlantic side, and vice versa, and also plane transportation. So the canal became an anachronism that was no longer of strategic interest to the United States, and so when we gave it up,
it's been recently enlarged by the Panamanian.
It has been enlarged, but
Whether
not by
that's
the
gonna
United,
work out, not
but
by the
not
United
by the
States.
United States,
Yeah.
by Canada, and we will see if it works out. One of the problems of the new canal, which is much wider and of course more modern, is that it requires a substantial amount of fresh water, and that fresh water comes from the adjoining rainforest. And there's less and less rain these days due to two factors. You have global warming, and secondly, you have the depletion of the rainforest getting smaller and smaller, and thus generating less and less water. So you can see now in the lake that supports the Panama Canal, little islands have popped up because of the water receding, making it difficult for ships to transit the canal.
Very interesting. And the canal is now more than 100 years old.
That's right.
Opened in August of 1914.
Yes, under Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
well, that's really interesting, George.
Right. So after I worked both for State Department and the Pentagon, I then came back to New Hampshire, opened up a law practice. My law practice now specializes in immigration law. There's only a handful of lawyers in New Hampshire and indeed New England that practice that kind of law. It's very tricky dealing with the Immigration Naturalization Statute. It can be as cumbersome as reading over the IRS code, and some of the nuances of immigration aren't even codified. It's by custom, and so. And beyond that, I've developed a niche that I call diplomatic intervention to do problem solving for people having problems overseas, dealing with embassies or foreign governments. So I do a lot of that work around the world, and every day I'm in a different country, virtually speaking.
So you're racking up lots of frequent flyer miles traveling around?
I travel around quite a bit. I was in India about a month ago working on a visa issue with the U.S. Embassy, actually consulates in Hyderabad and in New Delhi. But you know, a lot of my work with smart media these days is done by the internet and smart media. And so I speak to clients not only by telephone and email, but also through the use of Skype.
Yeah.
So sometimes I have to get up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning when I'm speaking to somebody in India or in China.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, George, and I'm really happy to see that this is what happened. In spite of your international career and being here and there, you still want to call New Hampshire home.
Well,
I guess that's going to be the situation indefinitely, right?
Oh, for the time being, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, I'm all over the place with you know, modern technology.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
It's changing everything.
it changes everything, and the practice of law has changed a lot, as you well know.
Oh boy, has it ever.
I don't meet face to face with my clients many times across on the other side of the desk, because a lot of my clients are on the other side of the world.
Yeah. Well, George, the reason I wanted to get you on the program, and I'm delighted you were able to make it here, was because of this opinion piece you wrote in the Union Leader on Monday, October 17th. In the headline, which I'm sure you didn't write, but it probably didn't displease you, New Hampshire diplomats are backing Hillary Clinton. And that caught my eye, and I read the article, and I thought there were some excellent points, and you were speaking not just for yourself, but other distinguished New Hampshire citizens that have had a role in our foreign diplomacy.
There is a group of 7 or 8 former U.S. ambassadors living in New Hampshire, so I picked up the telephone and called them up and to talk with them to see if we wanted to do a joint statement concerning the foreign policy positions of both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And I put together a piece, and we edited it, and everybody had their input. I mean, there was Dick Sweat, who was ambassador to Denmark, Terry Shoemaker, who was ambassador to Trinidad, Dan Benjamin, who's up at Dartmouth College, who worked in the National Security Council. You got Don Peterson, who was ambassador to Tanzania, living over in Brentwood. You know, Betty Tamposi, living on the Seacoast, who was Assistant Secretary of State.
Who, by the way, was a strong Republican for her public career.
A strong Republican, but interestingly enough, her son-in-law is Jake Sullivan, one of Hillary Clinton's very, very senior advisors on national security and foreign affairs.
So this piece, although you're listed as the author,
I wrote it.
is really endorsed by the others you mentioned.
It's endorsed by all the others, and it attempts to draw a contrast between the Hillary Clinton foreign policy and the Donald Trump foreign policy. And frankly, I don't think Donald Trump has a coherent foreign policy. I mean, the idea of closing down NATO, reintroducing waterboarding, torture, favoring Brexit and the potential breakup of the European Union, lauding
possibility of nuclear weapons for South Korea and Japan.
I mean, it's just astounding. And his coziness with dictators such as Vladimir Putin, a man he's never met, but who he lauds, you know, from time to time. And this idea of building a fence on our southern border, and without regard to the billions and billions of dollars that it will take to.
Well, we don't have to worry about it because he says
accomplish it.
Mexico's going to pay for it.
Well, you know, the interesting thing about the fence and the so-called flood of Mexican citizens, the flood is really in the opposite direction.
That's what I understand.
There is an outflow now of Mexican citizens and other Hispanics to the south from the United States. So when you combine the law enforcement, which has been occurring throughout the Obama administration, approximately 300,000 to 400,000 per year being deported, plus the what Mitt Romney would call self-deportation.
Yeah. That was always a hoot to me, self-deportation.
Well, I mean,
if he gets elected, he's going to get this big megaphone and say, okay, everybody, deport yourselves.
But from a practical standpoint, it's actually happening. So we started out at the beginning of the Obama administration with about 13 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States. Mm-hmm. We're down now to maybe 10.5 million.
Of course, these figures have got to be pretty soft. We really don't know.
They are soft. I mean, how can you really tell?
Yeah.
But we need immigrants in the United States.
Well, that's what I've always said.
They boost the economy. They provide innovation. They're youthful for the most part for a country that is aging, and so they're an important part of the U.S. economy. And if you remove them from the United States, you're talking about a reduction in GNP and a reduction in economic activity in the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
So immigration traditionally has been a good thing for the United States.
It certainly has. And as everybody says, we are a nation of immigrants. All of us who are U.S. citizens have an immigration history somewhere back there.
Yes, a concept that we sort of honor in the breach. I think something that most people don't realize is that when you're talking about deporting undocumented persons living in the United States, President Obama is called by many as the deporter-in-chief.
And that's because he's deported more people than any other president during his
deported more people than any
7 years in
other
office
president in history, and he deports them with the assistance of a whole series of federal agencies, and with the help of Congress, enough money is appropriated to deport a maximum of 400,000. They haven't appropriated any more money. That's the maximum the United States is capable of deporting. And you say, why? The reason is that if you want to deport more, you have to appropriate money for more judges, more courtrooms, more prosecutors, more jails, more border officials, more police. Mm-hmm. And so that's the amount of money that Congress has appropriated. And so if you take that as a given, for 400,000 per year at 10.5 million immigrants, you're talking about, if you want to get rid of all of them, 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so Donald Trump is talking about creating an immigration enforcement force.
He has talked about that.
So what does that consist of? Are you going to appropriate billions of dollars for what? Summary deportations, disregard the rule of law and all of our, trappings of due process and the orderly way of doing things? And are we going to start raiding people's homes, at 2 or 3 in the morning? I mean, how does this force operate?
You know what this makes me think of, George? This may be a crazy thing to say. The Fugitive Slave Act.
Well,
is part of one of the great compromises that put off the Civil War until, 1861 when war actually broke out. And we did to try and appease the Southerners over their desire to maintain their so-called peculiar institution, the slavery of human beings. We had officials all over the North trying to track down fugitive slaves and clap them on irons and ship them back to the South. I don't think it worked out very well.
it didn't work out very well.
And this is what this sounds like to me. Maybe I'm overstating it, but when Donald Trump talks about he was going to have a special force, I don't know what he called it, apprehension force or deportation force. I mean, my gosh.
Well, it verges on becoming a police state.
Yeah.
Where you've got these people with badges running around, detaining people and ushering them onto planes and buses and shipping them out of the country and breaking up families, including parents of American citizen children.
Right.
You're talking about a lot of pain and a lot of destruction to the U.S. economy.
And we should remind people, and Tim will be well aware of this, under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, a child born in the United States becomes a United States citizen merely because of that birth in the United States.
That's right.
And, so many of these people have come here and had children, and they're not documented. I mean, it's such a nightmare.
Yeah.
To contemplate what this might mean.
Yeah, and so when you look at the foreign policy between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, a person who has been Secretary of State, who understands the dynamics of international affairs and building relationships with foreign leaders and using diplomatic language and exercising the mechanisms of diplomacy to make friends and influence people around the world, you ask yourself, is Donald Trump capable of doing that? And given his behavior, I mean, the way he speaks harshly about people who disagree with him, his short attention span, I just don't think he has that light touch that often diplomacy requires.
Okay. Well, one more thing for you, George, then I want to talk to Tim, too. I forgot you there, Tim. But, one of the things that several people have said, and I'm wondering how you feel about it, Trump has said some things that seem just unreal, like going to build a wall across the entire 2,000 border from, Texas to San Diego. And when somebody said, well, what if Mexico doesn't, we're going to make it 10 feet higher.
Yeah.
But another thing he said is, calling on a ban of the entry of all followers of Islam, Muslims, into the United States. Now, he's had to backtrack on something like that. But I've heard people say, and I wonder if you share this concern, this is just playing into the trouble we're already having, appealing to the Muslim world, particularly in the Middle East and in the Arabian countries.
Well,
do you agree with that?
I think that's a valid point.
Yeah.
And he has said that he knows how to defeat ISIS better than the generals know how to defeat ISIS. And then, in the next breath, he says, upon taking office within 30 days, I'm going to instruct the generals to come up with a plan of defeating ISIS. Well, what do you think we've been doing up to now?
Yeah.
Presumably, the generals have been doing that.
Yeah.
There have, for sure, been mixed results, but nobody to date has come up with a better idea. And you're right. ISIS, in the end, is a religious and political movement that is not going to be defeated by the raw use of military force. It is going to have to be defeated by the assistance of other Muslim countries that share the United States views, and it doesn't advance U.S. interests to to turn those countries into enemies by first speaking harshly about them, and by cutting off immigration and cutting off trade and cutting off visitor visas and cutting off investment. My heavens, it would be a very strange world if that happened.
Yeah. And we've had Muslim Americans since the time of the revolution in this country.
Yep.
And, they are American citizens. They are entitled to all the benefits and privileges of that. And the Muslim faith has adherents in over 1 billion people in this world. I think it's probably the second most adherents of any religion, maybe to Christianity.
Well, and there is a First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution for
Right.
Those who believe in the U.S. Constitution that bars discrimination based upon religious beliefs.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Well, Tim, time to let you weigh in here.
Sounds fair.
You've been very active in the State House. You're seeking your third term, I believe.
Third term.
As I am. And well, what do you think about the Trump candidacy? And
Oh boy.
Got anything you want to add to what George has had? George has a very interesting perspective, I think.
Watching the Trump campaign play out is a little bit like watching the movie Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
You know how it's going to end, and you're just trying to enjoy the drama. But then every 5 minutes or so, somebody jabs you in the ribs and says, hey, this is real. And you have to remind yourself that there's actually a guy as the nominee of one of the major parties running for office who, as we talked about, his foreign policy is essentially just bluster.
Yeah.
That's really all he's got. No specifics. He talks about the generals as this abstraction, not recognizing that this is a group of diverse individuals who are single-minded on nothing except upholding and defending the Constitution. He casually dismisses suggestions that his crazy ideas would not be practical to implement. I mean, like we were just talking about his crazy idea to ban Muslims from entering into the United States. I'd really like to know how an immigrations and customs officer can detect what religion is in someone's heart. I'd really like to know how they're going to do that. Do they have a little measuring tool they can use?
Maybe we have to require them to wear identifying symbols, which was tried at a certain time that didn't work out so well. In another country in Europe, the 30s, which we did not like.
Well, when Trump started mentioning that immigration enforcement force, the first thing that came to mind is, this guy's trying to recreate the Bund or something. I mean, it's nuts.
Mm-hmm.
That his whole, I don't even want to call it foreign policy because there's no policy to it.
Yeah.
His foreign relation nonsense is almost as bad as his domestic nonsense. It blows my mind. And what I really feel the worst about, I mean, he's not going to win, but as we all do, I've got a lot of friends who are Republicans, and I feel bad for them because they don't have anyone else to vote for. I mean, obviously, some of them are going to vote for third-party candidates.
Yeah.
Some are going to vote for Hillary
that's
Clinton.
the case.
But, by and large, it's a two-party system. And in order for our system to work, both parties need to be credible and viable. They have to be vibrant parties with respectable people running for office at all levels of government. And when you have one of the two major parties collapsing in on itself. Like the walls are crumbling down and they're on fire as they're crumbling. That's not good for the state of our republic. Going beyond just the presidential election cycle. I mean, it says bad things about our democracy that this is happening in front of our eyes.
Well, I recall after the last election when Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama as he was seeking his second term, I believe it was then that the Republicans said they were going to have a major inward looking into their own brand, into their own messaging, and came up with a document that said, well, we have to find a way to appeal to a broader constituency, including our Spanish-speaking Hispanic Latino citizens, a major part of our country today, and including right here in Manchester. But it doesn't seem like much happened to that.
Well,
after this election, they're really going to have to do it in a very serious way if they intend to be a major party in this country going forward, I think.
Yeah, it's it almost defies belief. I mean, honestly, in my opinion, I think we're seeing the beginning of the end of the sixth party system. The current paradigm with the Republicans and the Democrats is fundamentally realigning, unless the Republicans really pull a rabbit out of their hat in the next 2 years, and entirely restore their party, before the midterms in 2018. But I don't see them doing it. I mean, the damage that's being done is so prevalent. You have the white supremacist element is coming out and being mainstream in the conservative movement now.
Yeah.
They never used to be mainstream. I mean, even back, in the Jim Crow era, the people on the politicians on the conservative side, for the most part, at least tried to maintain the facade that they didn't want these people's support. But now Trump is like, well, I don't know who David Duke is.
Yeah.
He's trying to play down and not scare these people away because he knows they're his base voters. And that's really scary for the Republicans.
So, Tim, one of the things that I've admired about you, as I've watched you at the State House, is first of all, you're always very well prepared. You're always well researched, and you're very well spoken. And one of the issues that I really, really admired you on, where I thought you had some incredible achievements beyond what I could expect, was trying to have the New Hampshire House, if not the New Hampshire Senate, weigh in on the problems with the unlimited dark money that's pouring into our political campaigns, which most of us think is the direct result of the Citizens United decision in the United States Supreme Court, a 5-4 decision.
Yep.
Where the justices reached way down to have a very far-reaching decision when they didn't need to, and the Republicans complain about an activist court. Well, this was an activist court on a narrow vote that said, there's no limits can be imposed because of First Amendment considerations, that money is speech, and corporations are persons within the meaning of the law.
Referenced heavily off of Buckley and Vallejo.
Buckley and Vallejo, that's exactly right. So where does that stand? And I can't imagine you're going to give up on this. You're still going after this, I imagine. Would you want to talk about that?
Oh yeah. So it's interesting. You mentioned the House and the Senate. I've actually got the bill through both chambers, just not at the same time. So it's a little bit of an interesting situation.
And this is with Republican majorities.
Right, this is with Republican majority because it's a bipartisan
issue. Consider that,
issue.
folks. That's
right.
really something.
It's a bipartisan issue.
It should
be.
be.
When you get down to it. I mean, nobody wants corruption. We may call it different things. We may have different labels for it. But, nobody wants this pay-to-play, legalized bribery, crony capitalism, whatever cosmetic label you want to stick on it. Nobody wants that. When you look at polls, enormous cross-sections of the public, well over 85%, some polls have it at 95% of the public, want to reduce the influence of money in politics. It's such an enormous problem that affects everybody. And the Citizens United decision specifically has been terrible because it sets case law. And, for folks who might be watching who might not be familiar with why that term is significant, when the Supreme Court makes a case law decision, lower courts are bound to adhere to the principles the Supreme Court outlined in that ruling. So when they have similar cases that come up, they're bound to follow the same paradigm and uphold the Supreme Court's views. And we've already seen that playing out down in the States where state-level campaign finance laws, state-level ethics laws for their legislators have been overturned all over the country. The most flagrant example that I usually talk about was in Montana. Their Anti-Corruption Act was overturned, and this was a 100-year-old piece of legislation. If my memory serves, it was originally passed in 1903, and in their legislature, they had problems with actual name brand corruption, like bags of money with a dollar sign on it exchanging hands out in the coat room. I mean, just flagrant wads of money corruption. Open bribery, in full view of everybody. No one was immune to it, and it was the only way anyone could get anything done. So eventually, a number of their legislators came together and passed this sweeping ethics and campaign financing law that established a good chunk of their state statutes. It had been amended over the years to keep up with modern times. Like mortgage securities didn't exist back then, so definitions were expanded. When it passed initially, it was a near unanimous vote, enormous public support, and sure enough, it was the entire Anti-Corruption Act for that state was overturned a couple of years ago as a result of the Citizens United ruling.
Oh, that's really something.
So it's the Wild West all over again, literally.
This makes me think, George and Tim, that Hillary's had to deal with her own problems in this campaign. We've heard more about emails than anybody, I think, ever wanted to. I frankly think Bernie was right when he said, we don't care about your damned emails. But apparently a lot of people do. And then there's a Clinton Foundation. Oh, my gosh, foreign leaders and foreign governments contributed to the Clinton Foundation. And as far as I can tell, the allegation is, as a result of that, some people got access to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. Access. Now, if that's a disqualifying thing, everybody in Congress has to leave. Every damn one of them, Democrat and Republican, because what the donors are getting is access.
That's right.
And it's not honorable. It's not good. I mean, we should all have a right to have access to our elected officials. But, like George Orwell's Animal Farm, some of the animals were more equal than others.
Yeah, right.
And some of the donors, because of the donations, are more equal than the rest of us and get more access.
And I really don't fully understand the access issue. Now, I contribute a few $100s each year to the Clinton Foundation and to the Clinton Library. And I've known the Clintons for 20, 30 years. So does that mean I can't visit with them or say hello to them?
Well, the question is, do you have to stand behind the folks that give a lot more money than you do before you get into visitor?
Well, I don't.
That's the question.
I don't think so.
Well,
but
maybe you should test that out, George.
But if you carry that forward, there's no example of any corrupting activity.
None whatsoever.
That came as a result of being able to shake Bill Clinton's hand or say hello to Hillary Clinton, and likewise, when you talk about the emails, nobody can point to any instance where our foreign policy was changed or the State Department and anything it was doing was compromised. Okay, so the emails didn't go out on the State Department server. A mistake, which she has apologized for. But on the other hand, so what? Nothing has happened
Right.
as a result of that. So for which we can all be grateful and thankful. But it's been totally blown out of proportion as something that was meaningful that has turned out to be not very much.
Well,
I think it brings us to a really important point, is that the whole upset about the emails and the accusations of pay for access and all this stuff, regardless of how it all plays out or how accurate any of it was. Think about this for a moment. The mere appearance of impropriety for this presidential candidate was enough to cause this national scandal. Of course, it was a manufactured scandal by political opposition, but the mere appearance of the situation that might have conceivably led to some theoretical impropriety is this, oh my God, national scandal. And, you know, part of the reason why a lot of people are so hung up on it, at least in my opinion, is that it smells like the corruption stuff that we were just talking about. And, you know, the media, in my opinion, the Fourth Estate doesn't do a very good job of really highlighting the different types of influence and corruption and access and everything that are actually out there in our political system, so that, you know, people can take a little bit better look and be able to distinguish between actual corruption and just a situation that they probably should have avoided but wasn't actually improper.
Yeah.
You know? And,
Right.
you know, when we look at some of the problems we had just last year in our state legislature, it's sort of the windmill I happen to tilt at, but the concept of the appearance of corruption is something that, as people involved in elected office and political life, we really owe it to our constituents to be incredibly cognizant of at all times. We had a bill last year that would have increased the minimum wage for tipped employees. You might remember this.
I do.
One of the people who was testifying on the bill went up and testified at great length about how increasing the minimum wage for tipped employees would bankrupt all these restaurants, and, you know, it would drive the in-person server industry out of business and all this stuff. And I guess he just neglected to highlight the fact until I went up and asked him. You know, he owns restaurants and bars that employ tipped workers. I mean, he has a direct financial stake in the outcome of this legislation. You know, we have legislators in our state legislature not only who speak and vote on bills that they have a direct financial stake in, they author and file bills that are going to directly financially benefit a business that they own, a family member who's employed by an industry who's going to get some huge break. I mean, you know, those are the actual tangible issues of corruption that really we should be paying attention to. But the media is silent on it because it doesn't make for a good headline.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no doubt, you know, our ethics requirements of the New Hampshire legislature are very few. There's not much you really have to do. Certain reporting if you spend a certain amount of money or raise a certain amount of money, but, you know, that's about it. And as you say, if you have an interest in I mean, we had two representatives from here in Manchester who had a definite interest because they ran a very popular, you know, restaurant bar here in Manchester, and they voted on many things involving that industry. And that's just the way it's happening. So, Tim, another thing I wanted to talk with you about, if we could, is a bill that I understand you were a key part of getting passed to help us move forward in an important way to address the opioid crisis here at Manchester by making it possible for the city to participate with the county in funding some initiatives. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting story of constitutional nuance that wasn't easy to work on. So, as a lot of people might remember, there was talk 2 years ago about doing a drug court at the county level. Mm-hmm. The county convention didn't approve the funding for it. So the Board of Aldermen, the city council here in Manchester, said, hey, you know, why don't we pay for that? I mean, the way, you know, I'm making a long story short, but the way that this drug court program was going to be structured at the time would have been primarily to benefit the city of Manchester, because the existing one was down in Nashua and it didn't have the coverage it needed. So we wanted to get one going up in the northern part of the county. So the city, a few of our aldermen said, hey, you know, well, why don't we just find out about funding that ourselves if the county's not going to do it with county funds? So, you know, people looked into it, and the city council and the mayor looked into it, and he got a letter from the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, Chief Justice Nato, a brilliant lady, basically pointing out that...
She's actually the Chief Justice of the Superior Court.
Oh, right. Pointed out that the city did not have the statutory authority to contribute funds to a county level program. You know, New Hampshire, we are an oddity among the 50 states. We're a reverse federalism state where towns and cities are not given a carte blanche empowerment to do whatever they want.
Yes, it's not a home rule state.
Right.
All the powers that our municipalities have to be granted by the state government.
Right. And going back, 200 and some odd years of our history, no one had ever granted the authority to the states or to the cities or towns to voluntarily contribute resources to the county or the state. Be that funds, be that an empty shed on the side of the highway, be that a fallout shelter, any one of a dozen things. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these types of coordination have been taking place for a long time on a routine basis. And no one had really thought about the legality of it, until this issue came up here in Manchester, started at our city hall. And you got to think about the wide-ranging implications of this. I mean, the city of Nashua volunteering one of their vans to the state police SWAT team, a town donating use of an ambulance to the county sheriff's department during a natural disaster or something like that. These are routine things that no one would hesitate to do for even a second, but they weren't authorized under New Hampshire law, which seems to be a pretty significant loophole in the way our statutes were set up. So I looked through the statutes after talking with a few of our aldermen and finding out that this problem existed, and submitted a very short one-sentence bill that was very simple. It added a line item empowerment for cities to contribute, material resources, funds, and personnel resources to county or state programs and initiatives, subject to an annual renewal. And it passed through the House committee unanimously. It passed through the House on what we call the consent calendar, which is just a unanimous vote. And it got to the Senate. It got to the Senate committee. They added in with an amendment some language that extended the same authority to towns in addition to cities, and it passed unanimously through the Senate.
That's really good.
I was very surprised. I expected a little bit more of a fight because it was dealing with local control, but very thankfully it went through nice and clear. So now going forward into the future, if we wind up, not only with the drug crisis, but if we have any manner of natural disasters or some disease outbreak or something like that. Now the cities and towns can work with the county and state without worrying whether or not they're authorized to do so, and if they need some special exemption or if they're going to have to go to court.
That's a good achievement, Tim, and I hope we get this thing going because the opioid crisis is so devastating.
It is.
George, what do you think we can expect from the debate tonight, and what do you expect to happen in the election? You got some predictions you'd like to lay on us?
Well, as Steve Schmidt, the Republican commentator, said recently on national television, the election is really over. We're mainly talking about whether and who survives down ballot from the presidential candidates. And so that's still very much up in the air. And while we're mentioning that, on October 30th, Sunday morning, 10 o'clock at Temple of Death Yeshurun at 152 Prospect Street, there's going to be a forum open to the public, Governor, Council, Congress, from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock, and the public is invited to attend and share in bagels, cream cheese, and other deli delights.
Will you be emceeing that one?
I will be emceeing that program.
I thought that might be the case, and I know that's been a tradition in our elections for a long time, so that's always a well-attended event.
Yes.
Tim, how's your campaign going? What are you hearing from folks about what do they care about in this election?
It's been a mixed gambit. It's hard to predict, a state representative race. I mean, this presidential...
None of us have any polls, do we?
Yeah, we don't. They don't poll at the state representative level. We're not important enough for that. And at the same time, with both of the presidential candidates, let's be very honest about it. Both of them are deeply unpopular.
Yeah.
And no one can predict what the turnout's going to look like. I mean, I think there's no question that Secretary Clinton is going to easily win New Hampshire. A poll came out today. I think it was 54 to 36. I mean, Trump is just taking a nosedive, and
Yeah.
I suspect
Apparently
after
it's happening
tonight-
all over the country.
Right. But, how that's going to translate into down-ballot election results for Congress, for state Senate, for state House, for county offices, no one can predict. No
Yeah.
one can predict.
Tim, I know you were a Bernie Sanders supporter. George, you've always been a Clinton supporter for both Bill and Hillary,
I have
and
been.
I've been a strong Hillary supporter. Tim's right. She seems to have a high unfavorability ratings for a candidate. I have an explanation for that, but what's your explanation? Why isn't she not more popular beyond the Democratic base?
I think one of the reasons, of course, is that for many years, over a long period of time, there has been voices in this country that have attempted to delegitimize anything the Clintons have done. It started out with Bill, then when he left the political scene, and the attitude was transferred over to Hillary, and she's been under relentless criticism
30 years?
as the years have gone by.
At least 30 years.
And has a remarkable career of assisting children, making friends for the United States overseas as secretary. Had done many good things for this country, and when you point to a record of accomplishment and compare it to what Donald Trump has accomplished in either the private sector or the public sector, his record pales in comparison to hers.
I don't think he has much of a public sector record at all, does he? Certainly no elected record, no military service
well,
record.
he brags that he was one of the people paying the bribes and donations we talked about earlier.
Yeah,
That's about the extent of his public sector experience.
that's right.
is-
He
is
said, I
writing
pay the
checks."
politicians and they do what we want.
That's right. And
He is almost
that's
an
right.
exact quote.
And he says, I come back to them 2 or 3 years later and ask for a favor, and they're right there for me.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
And, if he thinks that that's how the system should be working, he's not anyone I want anywhere near elected office.
Right, right.
Because I'm sorry, but that is the problem.
Yeah. I think the other problem that Hillary has, she will be our first woman president. And those of us that have daughters, and I think not just us, but everybody should applaud that. So many of the major countries in the world have had women lead them, whether it was Great Britain and
Great Britain, I mean, you have
even
Indira
Pakistan,
Gandhi,
and Indira
Pakistan,
Gandhi and
Golda Meir,
Golda Meir in
and
Israel, and on, Angela Merkel in Germany, and
Right.
on and on
It's
and
time
on.
for the United States to step up.
It's time for the United States to step up. But as a woman, I think she has a terrible time to thread the needle. I mean, we once had a candidate for president here whose campaign ended because he was supposed to have cried in front of the old Union Leader building on Amherst Street. His name was Ed Muskie from Maine. A fine man. And whether he cried or was snow melting in his face, nobody knows. But the word got out that he cried. It ended his campaign.
But this
Now,
is
if
where-
Hillary is aspiring to be the commander-in-chief, if she breaks down and shed a tear, and boy, I bet there's been some times when she would like to, it would be devastating for her. So she has to thread that needle, because if she appears too hard a person, then people don't like her, because that's not what they think they should see in a woman. On the other hand, she's not a woman. She is a woman, but she's also a woman running to be commander-in-chief and hold the most important position in the world. And I think she's threading that needle extremely well, but it's got to be tough for her
It's
every
a
day.
balancing act.
It's a balancing act. That plus the 30 years of relentless right-wing attacks on she and her husband, where she's even being blamed for her husband's marital shenanigans.
You hit something really important there. We have to, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll close my thoughts with this, but we have to look at this election in the larger context. The Republicans have been preparing to run against Hillary Clinton for the better part of 25 years.
Yep.
They have been, they have an not an Oppo binder, but an Oppo library. You know, there's no end to the amount of nonsense that they've conjured up out of nowhere over the years to drum up the Republican base to genuinely hate this person. And, you know, her unfavorables are almost 60%. I mean, it is unprecedented to have a major party nominee with unfavorables above 50% and still ahead in the national polls. Yeah. I mean, I can say, I will say as a Democrat, I thank my lucky stars every day that we're up against Donald Trump.
Yes.
Because I honestly believe that if we had any of the other Republicans, we would be looking at a much different electoral landscape.
Particularly because after 8 terms of any president, there's always a cry for change.
Right.
And, well, in any event, fascinating discussion. I don't know where our audience was today, but I'm sure I'll hear from them afterwards as the show repeats. George, thanks for coming down. And
pleasure.
Tim, it was great to have you here. And we'll be back next week, I hope, with Mike Farley. We'll be back from Florida. Hope all's well with him for another edition of the Progress Report as we wind down toward this all-important big national election here and across the country. Take care, everybody. Good night.